Thank you very much for joining us in our webinar today, Empowering Cross-Cultural Teams with Digital. My name is Chris Ellis, and I'm the host on the webinar today. I'm running our customer marketing team here at Orange Business Services. Just to let you know that during the webinar you will be muted today, except for our speakers, of course, and the webinar is being recorded for you to listen to or for others to listen to later. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, but you'll be able to type those questions onto the screen in front of you. We'll capture those questions during the webinar, and I'll put the questions to our speakers at the end. So please do think of questions and type them in as we go. We'll capture those and ask them in the last 10 minutes of the session. So the webinar today is all about collaboration and collaboration across time zones and cultures. We often hear from our business leaders that this is a key objective for them in terms of making organizations work better together, more efficient, more effectively, and more competitively. And it's an inevitable consequence really of the growing globalization of businesses that this sort of collaboration requires people to work together not just in different time zones but across wide-ranging cultures, which can often create its own quite difficult situations in terms of running multicultural teams. So we are very pleased to have two speakers to shed some light on this topic today, and hopefully to give you some ideas, some thoughts, and some ways of thinking about how to get the most out of multicultural collaboration. Firstly, we'll have Fons Trompenaars. Fons has been one of the most forward-thinking people in this area of multicultural collaboration for many years. He's been working in this area since 1997. And he is one of the founders of a international consultancy, Trompenaars Hampton Turner, that operates all around the world and maintains one of the world's largest databases in the field of intercultural management. Fons is not only an expert, but in my experience is also a very entertaining speaker, and I'm sure we're going to get a lot of pleasure listening to him this afternoon. Also on the webinar we'll have from Orange Business Services, Elsa Manville. Elsa is the head of the Major Service Center in France, and her teams are taking care of international operations for some of our largest customers, and she's working with teams spread all around the world, and so she will be able to bring a real-life view to the difficulties, challenges, and some of the solutions to running a multicultural team in the most effective way. So, without further ado, let me hand over now to Fons and ask Fons, please tell us, why is it so important to take into account multicultural differences in global business today?
And that is a wonderful way of illustrating culture. And why I'm saying this, because there are so many cultures today that are meeting, both physically, by traveling, but also by all kinds of means like social media, internet, and what have you. And what we have found is that logics of culture are seen as different aspects of the same issue. Let's take, for example, the Germans who would like a rectangle, and I'm in the top left-hand corner. And then we got the Italians who rather like the ellipse. But what we're realizing now, they're just shadows from a deeper reality called the cylinder. These are just different aspects and different viewpoints of the same issue. So, for example, if we have a law, the Germans might say we have to follow it, while for the same law, there are other interpretations by the Italians, but it's all the same law. And that makes it so interesting that we are trying to find a way of looking at culture as something that unites something on a higher level. If we can go to the next slide, then we see that we have an approach to culture that first of all, we need to recognize it. And the risk of these models of culture is that if we recognize cultural differences, we come into stereotypes. Oh, the French are like this, and we got the Japanese are like that. Therefore, a second step we need to take is to respect those differences. And respect starts when you understand that all cultural differences are somewhere in us, but we have ignored them and we have never realized them. Once we recognize and respect cultural differences, then we need to reconcile them. We need to say, gee, how can we combine this? Because, for example, if we have an international meeting, it's not good enough to know that we're different. We need to see if, for example, video conferences can be seen effectively by all the cultures attending. And reconciliation is the process of integrating opposites. And then finally, yeah, but what do I actually need to do? And that's called realization and rooting. If we go to the next one, then we see that culture has many layers. On the outside, we find the expressions of culture. The language we speak, the food we eat, the way we meet. And that is an area where we have to be careful, because on the outside, it looks all the same. We eat sushi and hamburgers. We have the same, let's say, iPhone. But the way it's used and the reason why we eat a hamburger is quite different across cultures. And we go to the next one, we see that it's only the artifacts and products that hide a deeper level of values and norms. A value is what we share in terms of what we like, and a norm is that what we really focus on in terms of what we need to do. When a value becomes a norm, it slips out of consciousness and becomes the deepest level, a basic assumption. So a basic assumption is closest to a belief. It's the area where we are unconscious of. It's implicit culture. If we then go to the next slide, we see that culture, in fact, is very often hidden. It's a hidden dimension in humanity where it's so strong that we even hide it for ourselves, and we reveal it when we go to another culture. That's called culture shock. Culture shock unhides that what is hidden for ourselves. If we take the next slide, then we see that if we want to define culture, where are these differences of values, norms, basic assumptions coming from? It's because we as human beings share problems. And to overcome these problems, like for the Dutch water, like for the Swiss mountains, like for the Americans big open spaces, these problems are overcome by human beings and lead to these different values. And these problems very often are dilemmas. The issue of dilemma is that on the one hand I could do this, on the other hand I could do that. And that leads to 7 dimensions. 7 dimensions which we will not all go through, but it's about, do we rather go for rules or consistency on the one hand, or are we liking to be flexible, individual versus group? Do we show emotions or not? That's the 4th dimension. Are we analytic or holistic? The 3rd. What gives us status? Is it based on what we do or who we are? Are we more step-by-step sequential, or are we processing in parallel, synchronic? And finally, what do we do with our environment? Do we control it, or is our environment controlling us? This is a 7-dimensional model that works very well to see the differences. Now, we have chosen some of those 7 dimensions in terms of what is most relevant in international communication through different media. And the obvious one is, do we show our emotions, or are our emotions expressed on the one hand, or do we keep our emotions to ourselves reserved? So the English, the Japanese are more reserved, while the Latin cultures like France, Italy are much more expressing their emotion. That's okay. It's professional. So we have asked people, in my society, it's considered unprofessional to express emotions overtly. Agree to disagree. Let's have a look at the results. We see indeed that a lot of Asian cultures tend to reserve their emotions. Let's not show them. From Japan to Singapore, all from Asia. And we go down the line, and we see, interesting, Asia is not all the same. Malaysia, much more expressive. France, Russia, Italy, we have emotions, show them. It's all okay. Now, how does that play a role in what we do with business? And then let's zoom in to international communication. In business, we see that emotions reserved. People look like more businesslike. They don't like to speak up. Very often it's shown by keeping a physical distance. While passionate, affective people are engaged, they speak up, raise their voice, etc., etc. So you understand, obviously, that this will obviously affect the way we communicate with each other. Are all the means that we use in international communication, social media, email, etc., are they devices that allow us to be expressing emotions or not? Don't forget, for example, if we use email, or you remember a fax, it doesn't show emotions. And that can be enormously limiting the way we communicate. There are cultures where in the tone of voice they give the meaning, and it's not expressed in what we do. And I would like to really give you some examples of the beauty of video conferencing, where you obviously get a great opportunity to show what we're doing. And I would like to invite Elsa to say, Elsa, what could you say about your experience in the way we deal with the different media to communicate vis-à-vis the expressions of emotions?
Hello, Fons. We have in operations global meetings with people around the world in different cultures, and we often have to make joint decisions. What we found most effective to match the different needs of the different cultures is to use video conferencing that enables us to perceive the weak signals from neutral cultures. So what we decided to do was, to have conference call for general meetings, but when we have important decisions to make, to have video conferencing. Another tool that we find useful for neutral cultures to be able to express themselves is to use instant messaging to get feedback offline from people who would not dare to give an opinion in public.
Wonderful examples, Elsa. So very often you will see that if you increase the channels of communication and combine the different ones, in my experience, that increases the effectiveness tremendously. It will not solve all the problems, but very often we only choose for one way. So if you have an email that is kind of neutral, yeah, we can use some emoticons, that helps, but we could indeed also add some of the communication channels to what we're doing. Let's go to the next dimension. And the next dimension is, a difficult word. Are cultures rather specific, or are they rather diffuse? This was based on the work of Kurt Lewin. Kurt Lewin was a German who went to America, and he said, Americans, you hardly know them, and they talk to you. Americans are like peaches. Why? Because there is a lot of accessible flesh with a tough nut in the center, while we Germans are more like coconuts. Coconuts are difficult to enter, but once you're in, it's very soft. And if we look at the next slide, you see this expressed by an American model, where, as you know, the refrigerator is easily accessible in America, very public. The car, take my car. Have you tried this in Germany? No, don't enter my car. It's my car and nobody drives it except me. In America, no problem. Furniture. In France, we have antique. It's very private. It belongs to the family, to you. In America, you move, you leave your furniture. It's public use. If two, what Kurt Lewin calls specific U-types, are interacting, you see that this leads to a specific culture. A specific culture meaning that you focus on certain aspects of the relationship. Are you married? Yes, for tax deduction. Also titles. When you get a title in America, it's specific to the situation. You are doctor in the university, but at the barbecue, you are Fons. Now compare that to the Germans in the next slide. The Germans are a hair doctor everywhere. They are the hair doctor at the barbecue, at work, in academia. And therefore, if two Germans, first of all, meet, you see that there is no relationship. They call you Sie and not du, like in France, vous and not tu. But you will see, once you know each other, then in the next slide, it all merges. If you are a hair doctor, your wife is Frau Doctor. Now, what does that mean if the two meet? On the next slide, you see, if the specific culture, like the Americans, meet the Germans, very diffuse, you get all kinds of misunderstandings. So, for example, what is a characteristic of a specific culture? Because of a specific culture doesn't integrate decor, it's specific, and they exclude privacy, they're very often direct communicators. In other words, the arrow for specific people is in their public life. That's why the way they communicate, known as low contact, is very direct. Diffuse cultures, like the Japanese, the English, they are very often indirect. They use very polite language, and they need many words to make the meaning clear of what they say. So instead of good and bad, they say it's interesting. And depending on the context, they give the meaning of what interesting means. Now, this is creating one of the biggest problems in international communication. Let's look at some of the characteristics on the next slide by asking the question, if a boss would ask you to paint his house, answer A, you see, my boss is the boss in the company, not outside. It's specific. Answer B, no, it's my boss, I need to help. It's always the case. Let's have a look at the scores. And what you see, the Netherlands scores very direct. The French, but for different reasons. When we interview the French, who in some situations are very diffuse, here score very specific. Because the French say, yes, we would help the boss as a friend, but we would not as a boss. In China, Singapore, South Korea, at the bottom, you would always help the boss to paint the house. So you see, if we go to the characteristics on the next one, that in specific cultures, on the left-hand side, the peaches, you first make the point, don't take it personal, positive or negative, and then gradually you work out. So if somebody has an ugly tie, you say, hey John, you have an ugly tie. By the way, I'm telling you this because normally you're dressed so well. While in a diffuse culture, gradually you make the point, hey John, you're normally very nicely dressed. How come that this tie is a challenge to that? It's an interesting tie, John. So it's a very indirect way of communication. And obviously, this affects tremendously on how we work on the way we communicate. So specific cultures, therefore, because they exclude their privacy, are open and direct, easy contact. They very often are hard selling, and they focus on things like shareholders. Diffuse cultures are polite and implicit, very often indirect, and they very often look at the larger picture, like stakeholders. It's high context communication. Now, before I ask Elsa, I would like to give you some generic stuff. This obviously, if we analyze the type of media we use for communication, it's very often between low context, specific, and high context, diffuse. The lowest context is Twitter and email. Why? It's direct, it's short, and you can have very few words to make the point. But if you don't give context with that, you are in trouble. So what we very often see is that high context ways of communicating, obviously the highest context is face-to-face. And face-to-face, you can see everything. You see non-verbal, you see the face, you hear the tone of voice. Now, what do we do if we communicate by email and we want to give a delicate message. It's very difficult. That's why if you, for example, communicate with the Japanese, again, we would advise you to open up communication channels. So you first write them an email and say, hey, I'll call you in a second. And you give a phone call on top of that where you can practice your tone of voice. So for high context cultures, open communication channels and use many. And it's very often forgotten. It's very surprising. And I would wonder if Elsa would like to give some more experiences from her practice.
Yes, Fons. We experience exactly what you have mentioned, where we find with some cultures the effectiveness of adding a phone call to an email. This is really present in how we operate on a daily basis with some cultures. Another example that we would like to give is how enterprise social networks, how we see they are used within the company. So we opened an enterprise social network for a few years now, and many business communities have been created throughout the world on specific topics, technologies, best practices, etc. But we also find that some people enjoy using enterprise social network for leisure communities. So we have the people from the specific cultures who also integrate this tool and use it for hobbies and to share some personal hobbies with their colleagues and their friends.
Very good, Elsa. And again, don't underestimate this. The way we communicate in low context cultures and in high context cultures, specific and diffuse cultures, is quite different. And you will see, therefore, that in Asia, the high context cultures, but also the Latin cultures, with a big difference, some combine it with showing emotions, like in the Latin cultures, and some who don't. We need to have other ways of communicating, or at least adding some ways of communicating. And that has also to do with, for example, how you use copying people. Because if you remember when the peach was meeting the coconut, it has also to do, and we haven't discussed this yet in detail, but a notice on losing face. You will see that in specific cultures, people can say direct things, all by email, without losing face, because they don't feel it as a personal thing. While in Asian cultures in particular, but also in Latin cultures, you know, for example, copying a bad message to colleagues means losing face. So I would say be very careful in who you involve in the communication, because people will lose face. If we go to the next slide, we see another area, and namely, how do we deal with time? And there are cultures, the sequential cultures, who organize time step by step. You recognize them. If they have a meeting at 1:45, they're there at 1:45. And they say, we stop at 3, you stop at 3. So they don't only do one thing at a time, but because they do one thing at a time, they want to stop and end meetings, for example, and agreements, deadlines, just in time. If we go to Latin cultures, as an example, or even better, the Arab cultures, they do things in parallel. They drive, they shave, they smoke, and they phone at the same time. They do things in parallel. And because they do things in parallel, known as the synchronic cultures, the multitasking cultures, you see that you can be a bit more relaxed with time. You even see the differences within France, between Paris and La Provence, where the Parisians are much more at the top, and people in southern France are much more synchronic. Now, this obviously has a great effect, if we look at the next slide, on the way we communicate. Because the reconciliation of the two is that the best way to speed up the sequence is to synchronize it. And that's called just in time. Now, if we look at the next slide, you see that the the sequential cultures, what is called monochronic cultures, cuts time in pieces. They do one activity at one time, and they're also dictated by the clock. While people who are synchronic, they much more believe that time will come again. They do things in parallel. And if you're on time or not depends on the relationship. So if you are a subordinate, you will see that you will be in time for the boss. If you're a boss, you can be late. And that is good to understand, because all the ways we communicate, the way we start a meeting or not, is very dependent in how we process time. And I would like to see, Elsa, if you have some examples how the different perceptions of time have affected what we do in international communication media.
Sure, Fons. We deploy global projects around the globe, and it is critical for us to have all stakeholders aligned on the same priorities and the same time frame, irrespective of culture. What we found as a good tool was to use audio and web conferencing that enabled us to display the usual flow charts that we would have for a project, but to liaise with all the team with the audio web conferencing and be able to give the context and the meaning that enable everybody to understand the main challenges and the priorities. Also, when we need to adapt throughout the project, we find that having those audio and web conferencing enable us to adapt the priorities to the changing environment more easily.
Yes, wonderful, Elsa. And the beauty of the technologies of today, you can either choose to go step by step, and let's take this type of presentation, the interesting type of different environments that we're living in goes step by step, and you organize your meeting accordingly. While you could also say, hey, let's use the different type of signals at one go. I would like to summarize also some of the context that we have been discussing. So you see on the left the context for type of technologies: fax, email, groupware. It increases the context. Teleconferencing, because that includes text, if you like, or some graphics and phone calls. But obviously face-to-face is the highest. And the beauty of today is that if you have different type of cultures, you can increase the media according to which you communicate. Again, I'm emphasizing that because it's very often forgotten. We choose for one or for the other. While if you combine them, the risk that high context cultures are lost is much smaller. If we go to the next slide, we see that Elsa, on this level, you have had a lot of experience. Why don't you share that with us?
Yes, Fons. We have a lot of offshored activities, and we have teams who work on a daily basis between themselves on the same workflow. And what we found interesting was when we implemented those workflow is to build some remote teams with video conferencing and enabling them to see each other, to interact directly. For example, we did that in a seminar, so in a room with also some mobile devices where the people could actually have a really individual face-to-face introduction.
Yes.
We found that this increased the cooperation between the teams, and to have this at a regular time frame really improves the cooperation and the ability to deliver performance.
Wonderful examples. Thank you very much. Let us go to the next slide, and we will see that there are some key takeaways we could share. So let me summarize. Culture affects the way we communicate, and our devices are very much hindering or helping us to adapt the way we communicate across cultures. Because nowadays we are connecting different cultures, we need also to combine all these type of devices. And first of all, a key takeaway is be aware of this. And once you are aware of this, you show that you reach out and you respect your colleagues from different orientations. And the respect will help you to adapt or at least be aware of the different communication styles across cultures. Very, very helpful is that the informality of communication works in any culture. So especially in high context cultures, create a lot of informal moments offline, if you like, during the dinner rather than in a meeting. And combine that with the meeting, where you perhaps in the meeting have a great moment to check understanding what you discussed informally. Increase the media types of media in communication, and also be aware of your own default style. So we Dutch are very often direct, and it's good to know that you might insult people with that. And also try to see that if we talk about Asia or Europe, there are many differences within those environments. And therefore, you will be much more aware of the interpretation of certain signals. If somebody shuts up, what does that mean? For some it means listening, and for others it means, oh, you insulted me. The same with laughter. So these are the real takeaways that we would like to have discussed with you. If we go to the next one, we will see that there is nothing left to thank you, because sorry for the little technical glitch that I had here being in America with the internet of the hotel, but it was a pleasure at least to be with you a little late, but I think we have practiced, and it was not done on purpose, what we are talking about when we communicate internationally.
Well, thank you so much, Fons. Really some very insightful thoughts and experience there. We've got a couple of questions we're going to put to you in a minute. But just for the audience to know, as you can see on the slide here, we have access, and you will have access to an analysis profiling tool within Fons' company's website. So when you get the link later today with the materials from the webinar, you'll be able to follow that link, and with this password access that tool if you'd like to do a little bit of profiling of your own intercultural awareness. You might find that's interesting and give you a few thoughts for your own interaction with other cultures. I certainly found it very interesting to go through that profiling myself. And I think it's certainly very true that we all, as in international business community, have experiences of dealing in situations with other people where you do wonder quite what they're thinking about because it seems quite different to your own ideas and so on. And having that intercultural awareness can really help business and collaboration. So I've got a couple of questions coming up, Fons, but just before I ask you those, just to share a couple of quick slides around Orange Business Services. For those of you on the webinar today who are not perhaps too familiar with Orange Business Services, we obviously provide technology solutions and systems that can really help overcome many of these multicultural and teamwork collaboration challenges, and with a balance of the right different solutions, such as obviously voice, straightforward, but also messaging, conferencing, video conferencing, and unified communications, provide the best overall balance, depending on the cultural interactions, to provide the most optimal sort of collaboration experience. One specific area just to mention in a little more detail is the social collaboration area. We're in fact just launching a new enterprise social collaboration solution, which can provide a really interactive and a more contextual platform for people to collaborate in the way that they best suits their own cultural stance, depending on their own profile. That solution called ShareSpace will be launching in the next month. And if you're interested in obviously finding out more about any of the things in our portfolio, then you can follow more information from our website again, which you'll find linked in the information we send out today. So just to finish off, Fons, I have a couple of questions that we've got. Now, one which I think a couple of people were definitely thinking about as we went through there, and I know it's come up before, is that when you talk about these multicultures, it can sound a bit stereotyping, Fons. So, I mean, how much do you really believe that these characteristics that you've described today represent real life, or you know, do you think it's a criticism that people have a fair one, that you're really just painting a stereotype there that's not a true life story?
No, I fully agree. But to ignore them is as stereotypical as not to ignore them. Stereotypes are okay under two conditions. One is that you know it's an exaggeration. Yeah, it's a model. If we talk about low context and high context communication, that is a stereotype because there is a lot in between. And secondly, stereotypes very often are judged, namely it's bad or it's good. My advice would be know that it's an exaggeration, and secondly, that withhold judgment. One is not better than the other. Now, another point is that nowadays we get all kinds of diversity mixing. We get gender diversity. Indeed, males in general act differently than females, but obviously there are different type of females and different type of males. If you draw a normal distribution, there's a lot of overlap of two normal distributions, different type of men, different type of women. Or if you look at generational culture, millenniums, baby boomers, traditionalists are different cultures with variety in them. What makes it so difficult today, if you have a young American female talking with an old French male, what is causing what? Are you female? Are you male? Are you young? Are you old? Are you French? Are you American? And at the end of the day, I would go beyond stereotypes and I would say, who cares? But what is the issue in communication between them? And the beauty of what we said earlier, even if you have stereotypes, is that if you open communication channels, wherever the diversity is coming from, stereotypes or not, can be dealt with more effectively.
Okay,
so
thanks, Fons. I think
my answer. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great answer, and perhaps it really is. The point is not to stereotype people, but to realize within a teamwork environment, you're going to have people with a broad spectrum of different styles and characteristics that you need to understand and take into account.
Exactly.
I have a second question now. Maybe this one is more for Elsa to answer. Elsa, so you talked about the different sorts of tools and approaches that you use with the teams. How much sort of guidance do we give to people in terms of helping them to know which tools, which solutions could be the best ones to use? Video, messaging, different collaboration tools. Do we leave it up to them to decide, or do we try and give them some guidance on that?
The guidance that I'm trying to give my teams, I mean, first of all, in terms of multicultural, I think it's about building the awareness, as Fons said, and enabling people to basically detect from their individual relationships how are what the people they interact with are sensitive to. I think that's the first step, is about building this collective awareness. And then the second step is, for me, what I find is that the more difficult the situation is, the better off you are if you multiply the communication channels. If it's a simple, basic issue, of course, email would be the most effective. But if you have something that is, either a decision to take or some bad news to share with people, or something that goes wrong, you tend to be better off if you multiply the communication channels.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Okay, thanks.
Very good.
Okay, thanks, Elsa, for that. And just one final question back to you, Fons, maybe around the sort of mixture of teams. What do you see as the most successful teams? Are they ones that typically are created bringing together people that are more sort of the same? Or is it teams where you've got a spread of different types of culture that end up being the most effective teams, even if they may be, let's say, a bit more difficult to manage?
Now, there is recent research by Di Stefano showing that if you increase the diversity of teams, that either the results get better or worse, and the difference is made in leadership. So leadership is crucial to the effectiveness of teams once it is diverse. So you can excel like a good soccer team, a good football team, if the different cultures in the team can cooperate well by and very often around the top player who's the leader. My advice for multicultural teams, if you take the risk and you have good leadership, is first look at what you share. As a team, it's because the focus on diversity is interesting, but you need to start by sharing. And sharing is very often in terms of tasks. Be very clear about the task you're about or about the values. And that's very often forgotten. Organizations have learned that lesson, that if you are diverse as an organization, you need shared values to deal with it. So those are my first tips. And then,
okay.
Yeah, it sounds almost obvious. Take a lot care about the communication issues and open channels. So, for example, if you have a multicultural team that is physically dislocated and virtual, make sure that sometimes they meet. Once you have met, it's much easier to then communicate remotely.
Okay, Fons. I think, sorry to stop you if you had more points to make there, but I do want to make sure we finish right on time because that's my culture. So thank you so much for joining us, everybody, today. And thank you, Fons, and thank you, Elsa. Everybody will get a link later today with the materials. We hope you enjoyed it and found it a useful time. And we hope you'll join us on the next webinar that we run soon around these topics. So thank you very much for joining us today, and good afternoon, good morning. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Chris, for hosting us.
Thank you, Fons. Thank you, Elsa. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Bye, Elsa. Bye.